Have you ever looked at your family and wondered if everything you believed was a lie? It's strange how one moment can shatter the image you've held in your mind for years. You go through life thinking you know your parents, your siblings, even yourself. But what if you're just playing a role in someone else's carefully crafted story? That question hit me like a storm the day I found the letter hidden behind the old mirror in the attic. A letter that would unravel my entire world and turn my understanding of family into a maze of secrets, betrayals, and revelations. Let me start from the beginning. I grew up in a quiet town where nothing much ever happened. You'd think it was the perfect place to feel safe and settled. Everyone knew each other. People smiled on the streets, and gossip traveled faster than the morning fog rolling down the hills. My family was well regarded, maybe even admired. My father was a retired army officer, always strict but fair, while my mother kept our home pristine and filled with warmth. I had a younger brother, Daniel, and for as long as I can remember, he was the golden child. Not that I was neglected, but the way people looked at him, the way my parents seemed to light up around him, it was different. Still, I never questioned it. I went to school, did what I was told, and tried not to make waves. We had family dinners every evening, Sunday visits to my grandparents' old farmhouse, and summer trips to the lake. It was all normal, almost boring in its predictability. But there was always this undercurrent, a sense that something was being carefully maintained, like a painting that keeps getting touched up so no cracks show. I remember one particular evening vividly. It was raining, not heavily, just a steady drizzle that made everything seem softer, quieter. I was in the attic, going through boxes for a school project about family history. My mother had told me to avoid the far left corner, said it was full of useless junk. Naturally, that's where I went first. I wasn't expecting much. Some broken frames, old Christmas decorations, maybe a few forgotten toys. But then I noticed the mirror. It was old, the kind with a wooden frame that had once been painted gold but was now mostly chipped and faded. Behind it, wedged into the back panel, was a folded piece of paper. At first, I thought it was just an old receipt or a list. But when I unfolded it, my hands trembled. It was a letter. The handwriting was elegant but firm, and it started with the words I still can't forget. If you are reading this, then you know something is wrong. The rest of the letter was cryptic. It mentioned a decision made long ago, a truth buried for the sake of peace, and a plea for forgiveness. No names were mentioned, no dates, just enough to stir a storm of questions in my mind. Who wrote it? What truth? What decision? I didn't tell anyone about the letter. Something about it felt dangerous, like opening a door that had been locked for a reason. But I couldn't leave it alone. I started watching more closely, the way my father seemed to flinch whenever old family stories came up. How my mother would quickly change the subject if we talked about her childhood. Even Daniel, who usually wore confidence like a second skin, seemed to avoid eye contact whenever I asked questions about when we were little. Have you ever had that eerie sensation when you walk into a room and feel like everyone just stopped talking about you? That became a regular occurrence. I started to feel like a stranger in my own home, like the life I had was somehow borrowed or worse, built on something false. One night, I went back to the attic, hoping to find more. I dug through boxes, checked behind picture frames, under old rugs. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I found a small wooden box wrapped in a moth-eaten cloth. It was locked, but the hinges were old and brittle. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small locket. The photographs showed my parents, but younger, standing with a woman I didn't recognize. In one picture, she was holding a baby. My father stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They looked like a family, not like friends, not like distant relatives, like something more. I stared at that image for what felt like forever. The resemblance was undeniable. The baby looked like me, but the woman wasn't my mother. From that moment, everything changed. I began to question every story I had been told, every birthday photo, every memory I had taken for granted. I became obsessed, consumed by the need to know the truth. Who was that woman? Why were those pictures hidden away? Why was there a letter begging for forgiveness? Couldn't sleep. I barely ate. My thoughts were constantly spinning, retracing every step, every moment that suddenly felt suspicious in hindsight. What if I wasn't who I thought I was? What if my whole identity was a patchwork of lies? It's a terrifying feeling, to look in the mirror and not recognize the person staring back. And yet, I couldn't stop. I had to keep digging. I had to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Have you ever uncovered a secret that changed the way you see someone you love? That was just the beginning for me. Stay with me. There's more. Much more. That night, after finding the photographs and the locket, I couldn't bring myself to go back downstairs. I sat there in the attic, the air thick with dust and silence, my mind racing through every possible scenario. The woman in the photo haunted me. Her face wasn't entirely unfamiliar, as if I'd seen glimpses of her before. Maybe in dreams or fleeting moments of déjà vu. But now, with the photo in my hand and the letter still fresh in my memory, everything took on a darker hue. Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying my childhood memories in my head, trying to find cracks in the timeline. There were moments that suddenly felt suspicious, like the way my mother used to pause when I asked about the day I was born, or how there were almost no baby photos of me, just a few starting around age 2. Back then I thought nothing of it, but now those gaps screamed at me. The next morning I forced myself to act normal. At breakfast I watched my parents, trying to see them through this new lens. My father, always measured and reserved, looked over the newspaper with his usual furrowed brow. My mother, ever attentive, placed toast on Daniel's plate and reminded him to pack his umbrella. To anyone else, it was a picture-perfect moment. But to me, it felt like a scene from a play, rehearsed and repeated too many times. I considered confronting them. I really did, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what they'd say, or maybe I wasn't ready to hear it. So I waited. I watched. I listened, and then I started searching. I went back to the attic every evening when no one noticed. I sifted through boxes I hadn't touched before, opened envelopes that smelled of old paper and secrets. One day, I found another letter, this time tucked inside an old book of poetry. It was addressed to someone named Eleanor. Again, no last names, but the tone was familiar, affectionate, regretful. It spoke of choices made out of love, but with consequences that couldn't be undone. Eleanor, that name lingered in my head. I checked every family photo album I could find, every document in the filing cabinet in the study. Nothing. It was like she never existed, or someone wanted it that way, but I wasn't alone in my suspicions. A few days later, I noticed Daniel acting strangely. He's always been the confident one, the charming one, the one who never seemed to have doubts. But lately, he'd been quieter. He avoided eye contact. Once, I caught him staring at me with a look I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, or fear. I wondered if he knew, or worse, if he'd always known. Have you ever felt like the people closest to you are guarding a truth they'll never willingly share? That's what it felt like. Every conversation became a performance. Every moment felt like it carried unspoken words beneath the surface. I kept everything I found in a box under my bed. The photographs, the letters, the locket. I didn't know what I was going to do with them yet, but I couldn't let them go. They were pieces of a puzzle, one that seemed to stretch far beyond what I had imagined. Then one evening, I overheard something that stopped me cold. My parents were in the kitchen. I was on the stairs, just out of view. Their voices were low, tense. My mother said something about keeping it buried and not hurting him now. My father replied, "He's not a child anymore. If he's asking questions, he deserves to know." I held my breath. I didn't move, couldn't. My heart pounded so loudly I thought they'd hear it. But the conversation ended abruptly when Daniel walked in. Their voices changed, lightened, like nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. That night, I opened the locket. It had taken me days to find the nerve. Inside was a photo, a tiny, faded image of the same woman from the attic picture. On the other side was a lock of hair. I sat there for hours, turning it over in my hands, trying to connect the dots. What did she mean to my parents? Why did they hide her? Why did they hide me? I didn't have the answers yet, But I knew I was close, closer than ever. And I knew one thing for sure. Whatever truth was waiting for me, it wouldn't stay hidden for much longer. After that night, something in me shifted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a need to know who I truly was. The pieces I had were no longer enough. I didn't want whispers in the attic or faded photographs. I needed clarity. I needed answers from the very people who had spent my whole life pretending. But I had to be careful. I started by looking into public records. I told my parents I was doing a genealogy project for school, which wasn't a complete lie. I dug through birth certificates, marriage licenses, anything that could give me a hint about Eleanor or about my own origins. Most of it led nowhere, just the same names I already knew. But then I stumbled across something. There was a certificate of birth. My name was on it, my date of birth. But something felt off. The hospital listed wasn't the one I had always been told I was born in. The attending physician's name didn't match any of the family stories. And then there was the strangest part. The mother's name was listed as Eleanor Grace. It hit me like a wave. Eleanor wasn't just someone my parents had known. She was my biological mother, the woman from the photo, the one holding the baby that looked exactly like me. All at once, the locket, the letters, the secrecy, it all made sense. But it also opened up a new, far more painful question. What happened to her? I didn't confront my parents. Not yet. I was still trying to understand the implications. Had they adopted me secretly? Had Eleanor died? Was she forced to give me up? There were too many possibilities, and I didn't trust them to tell me the truth. Not the full truth. I started having dreams. Or maybe they were memories, pieces of the past rising to the surface. I would see a woman's face in the dark, hear her humming a tune that made my chest ache. Sometimes I'd wake up with tears on my cheeks, not knowing why. I began to wonder if some part of me had always known. If children carry fragments of their earliest bonds, even if they're buried deep. Daniel noticed the change in me. He started asking if I was okay, if something was wrong. I brushed it off, but his concern seemed too genuine, too focused. One evening, he asked if I was going back to the attic again. I froze. I hadn't told anyone I'd been up there. When I asked him how he knew, he just shrugged and walked away. That moment replayed in my head for hours. Was he watching me, or was he trying to protect me? That question haunted me as much as anything else. Daniel and I had never been particularly close, but there was always an unspoken understanding between us, a kind of mutual respect. But now I was starting to question even that. If he knew something, if he had always known, why hadn't he said anything? One afternoon, I returned home early and found Daniel in my room. He was standing near my bed, looking down at the box where I kept the letters and photographs. He didn't touch anything, just stood there, hands in his pockets, lost in thought. When he noticed me, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded and walked past me without a word. That night, the box was gone. Panic set in. I turned my room upside down, checked every hiding spot, every drawer. It was nowhere. I felt like the floor had dropped out beneath me. Everything I had collected, the proof, the pieces of my identity, gone. My trust, already fraying, snapped completely. I didn't confront Daniel right away. Couldn't. My emotions were too raw, my mind too clouded. Instead, I went back to the attic, hoping to find more. Anything. But the space felt different now. Colder, emptier. Like the house itself knew I was getting too close to something that wasn't meant to be uncovered. And then, just when I was about to give up, I noticed a loose floorboard near the far corner. It was warped and slightly raised. I pried it up carefully. Underneath was a small cloth pouch, stained with time. Inside were more letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Eleanor. But these weren't from my father. They were from Eleanor herself. And as I began to read, a new voice emerged. A voice filled with pain, love, and desperation. She had fought to keep me. She had begged for another way. She had written about visits denied, about moments stolen, about a promise made to protect me, but also a warning that one day I might come searching. I had found her, and now I had to decide what to do with her truth. The attic became my sanctuary. not because it was comfortable or inviting, but because it was the only place left where I could feel close to her, to Eleanor. Her words, written in trembling ink on aging paper, spoke to me like whispers through time. She wasn't just a ghost in the shadows anymore. She was real, and through those letters, she became alive in my mind. Each note was a glimpse into her heartbreak. She wrote about watching from a distance, hoping for a chance to be near me. She mentioned names I didn't recognize, people who had helped her, people who had stood in her way. There were letters dated years after I was told she was gone. That detail alone shattered another lie I had lived with. Eleanor had been alive longer than anyone let on, which meant my parents hadn't just hidden the truth from me. They had hidden her. Some letters hinted at visits, at attempts to see me. One described a moment when she stood across the street from my schoolyard, watching me play. She wrote about the way I laughed, how I had my father's eyes but her smile, how she almost stepped forward but stopped herself for my safety. I read that passage over and over, trying to picture it, trying to imagine a woman, alone, full of love and pain, watching her child grow up from afar. I couldn't understand how my parents could do this. What had happened between them and Eleanor? What had driven them to erase her so completely from my life? The weight of these truths made it harder and harder to be around my family. Every dinner became unbearable. I'd sit there, nodding along, pretending, while inside me a storm raged. My mother's smile felt forced. My father's silence loomed larger. And Daniel, he barely looked at me anymore, until one night he finally spoke. It was late. The house was quiet. I was sitting alone in the darkened living room, reading another letter. Daniel walked in and didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching me. Then he said, almost in a whisper, that he didn't take the box. He had found it on my bed and moved it, fearing someone else might find it. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't let go of the doubt. He sat beside me, and for the first time in years, he looked vulnerable. He told me he remembered Eleanor. Not much, but enough. He remembered a woman visiting once, when he was very young. He remembered her bringing a toy, a wooden bird, and how our mother had cried after she left. He said our father had told him never to speak of it again. That was the moment I realized Daniel had been living with shadows too. He had buried them deeper, perhaps even convinced himself they weren't real. But now, faced with my obsession and the letters I had found, he could no longer keep the cracks sealed. I showed him Eleanor's letters. I watched his face as he read, his eyes wide, his jaw tight. By the time he finished, he was shaking. He said he needed air and stepped outside. I didn't follow. I knew he needed time. The next day, I found the wooden bird. It was in a small box at the back of Daniel's closet, tucked away like a sacred relic. He hadn't imagined it. Eleanor had been there. She had tried, and they had shut her out. That discovery changed something between us. Daniel didn't fight me anymore. He didn't tell me to stop or let it go. Instead, he asked what I planned to do next. And honestly, I didn't know. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on someone else's grief? That question wouldn't leave me. I carried it everywhere, to school, to bed, into every silent moment. Eleanor's truth had become a part of me, but I still didn't know how to face the people who had hidden it. I wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. So I focused on finding more. Eleanor had written about someone named Margaret, an old friend who had helped her during the darkest times. No surname, no address, just a mention of a cottage by the edge of town. I knew that part of town, a quiet, forgotten stretch with overgrown hedges and broken fences. One afternoon I went there. The cottage was still standing, weathered and small, with ivy curling up its sides like fingers clutching at the past. I knocked, not knowing what to expect. An elderly woman opened the door. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, softened when I said Eleanor's name. She invited me in, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt something shift, like I was walking into another chapter of a story that had waited too long to be told. The woman introduced herself simply as Margaret. Her voice was calm but carried the kind of weight that comes from witnessing too much and surviving all of it. She asked no questions at first, just motioned for me to sit in a worn armchair by the fireplace. The cottage smelled like lavender and old books, a contrast to the storm swirling inside me. She disappeared into the kitchen for a moment and returned with 2 cups of tea. Only after we sat in silence for a while did she finally speak. She said she had been waiting for this day, though she wasn't sure it would ever come. And then, without needing any prompting, she began to talk about Eleanor. Margaret described her as bright and soft-spoken, strong-willed but kind. She said Eleanor had always dreamed of a quiet life, a home, a child, peace. But things had not gone as she hoped. There had been love once, real love, but it had been tested by secrets, shame, and pressures from a family that wanted to control everything. Margaret never named my father, but I didn't need her to. I knew. She told me Eleanor had been pushed away, that decisions had been made behind closed doors, that there were lies told not just to me but to Eleanor too. She hadn't willingly given me up. She had been promised something, time, contact, a chance, and then nothing, silence. It was hard to listen to, harder still to imagine what it must have felt like for Eleanor. To be told that the child you carried, the one you loved, would be raised by others without your name or your presence. Margaret said Eleanor wrote letters almost every day. Some were sent, some were kept, some were never meant to be read at all. She handed me a small bundle of these, tied with a ribbon that had faded to a dull gray. Each letter felt like a breath from the past, a window into her thoughts as she tried to live with the ache of absence. She never stopped hoping, never stopped loving, never stopped believing that one day I would come looking. Margaret paused often while speaking, as though revisiting these memories was like walking barefoot through thorns. But I sat quietly, giving her time. I felt like a guest in someone else's grief. And in many ways I was. She showed me a photo of Eleanor taken just a few years before she passed away. Her hair was streaked with gray, but her eyes still held warmth. I saw myself in her expression, that same tilt of the head, the way she held her hands in her lap. For the first time in my life, I saw someone who looked like me, not just physically, but in the quiet strength behind the eyes. Margaret asked if I hated my parents. I didn't know how to answer. I said I didn't hate them, not fully, but I couldn't forgive them. Not yet, not without understanding why. She nodded like she expected that. She told me there were things I didn't know yet, things that Eleanor had never written down, things that might never be fully explained. Then she asked me something I didn't expect. She asked if I wanted to see where Eleanor was buried. We drove together in silence, through winding country roads lined with trees that had long since lost their leaves. The cemetery was small and secluded, almost hidden behind an old stone wall. Margaret led me to a quiet corner beneath a tall oak tree. The gravestone was simple, just her name, Eleanor Grace, and the dates of her birth and death.
No inscription, no epitaph.
Nothing to hint at the complexity of her life or the love she carried to the end. I stood there for a long time. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I felt hollow, like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the picture it revealed was almost too much to bear. I whispered a few words, unsure if they mattered. Then I placed my hand on the cool stone and made a silent promise. I would not let her story disappear. Back at the cottage, Margaret handed me one last envelope. She said Eleanor left it with her in case I ever came. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but they were enough to change everything again. She wrote that love doesn't disappear, even when it's silenced, that truth always finds its way home, and that she had never, not for 1 second, stopped believing in me. I left Margaret's cottage feeling like I had both gained and lost something enormous. I had found my mother, but I had lost the chance to truly know her. And now there was only one thing left to do. I had to confront the people who had buried her memory and ask them why. I returned home just before dusk. The sun had begun to slip beneath the hills, casting the house in a long golden shadow. It looked the same as always, quiet, well-kept, ordinary. But to me, it felt like a stage set for a final act. Every window, every corner, seemed to hum with the weight of what was about to come. I walked through the front door and found my parents in the living room. My mother was knitting, her hands moving automatically, eyes distant. My father sat across from her, silent, his posture stiff. Daniel was nowhere in sight. They looked up when I entered, their faces calm but uncertain. I wondered if they had sensed it too, the shift in me. I didn't ask them to sit. I didn't raise my voice. I just began to speak. I told them I had found Eleanor's letters, that I had seen the photos, read the words she had written over decades, that I had stood beside her grave. My voice didn't shake. There was no accusation in my tone, only a deep, aching need for the truth. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my mother put down her knitting. Her hands trembled as they rested in her lap. She didn't look at me when she began to talk. She said they had never meant to hurt me, that everything they did they believed was for the best. That when Eleanor became pregnant, it caused a scandal they weren't prepared to deal with. My father's career was on the line. Their families had threatened to disown them, and Eleanor, they said, wasn't considered suitable. It was hard to listen to. The words felt rehearsed, like they had told themselves this version of the story so many times they began to believe it. But I pressed further. I asked why they hadn't let her be part of my life, why they erased her so completely. That's when my father spoke. He said Eleanor had tried to stay in contact. She had written letters, called, even showed up once. But they were afraid she would confuse me, destabilize the life they had built. So they shut her out. He admitted it without pride. His voice was low, weary. He looked old in that moment. Not in years, but in burden. My mother finally looked at me then, her eyes full of something between guilt and sorrow. She said she used to dream about Eleanor knocking on the door. Said she thought about telling me the truth many times, but fear always won. I wanted to scream, to ask why my right to know had meant so little. But I didn't. I just stood there, letting the silence between us grow heavier. After a while, I asked if they ever truly loved Eleanor. My father didn't answer. My mother said yes, and that somehow made it worse, because if there had been love, then how could they bury it so deep? Later that night, I sat alone in my room. I held the last letter Eleanor had written to me, the one Margaret had kept all these years. I read it again, trying to absorb every word, every emotion pressed into that page. She had written that I was born out of love, even if I was raised without the truth. That love had no expiration, no matter how long it had been kept in the dark. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I went for a walk. The sky was just starting to brighten, a soft blue bleeding into gold. I wandered aimlessly through town, thinking of everything and nothing. At one point, I found myself outside the school I had gone to as a child. I stood at the edge of the playground and imagined Eleanor, years ago, watching from across the street. Did she know then that she would never be allowed in? That she would have to love me from a distance, always hoping but never fully belonging? And now that I knew the truth, what was I supposed to do with it? Forgiveness wasn't simple. It wasn't even close. But I realized that morning that I didn't want vengeance. I didn't want to destroy the life I had, even if it was built on silence. I just wanted to carry Eleanor's truth forward, to speak her name, to honor the love she never stopped giving. When I returned home, I went to the attic. I cleared a space. I laid out the letters, the photos, the locket, everything. I arranged it carefully like a shrine, not to mourn her, but to recognize her, to give her back her place in my story. And for the first time in my life, I said her name out loud, Eleanor, and I didn't whisper it. I let it ring through the silence, as if the house itself had been waiting to hear it all along. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently. The silence that had once been so thick began to feel like space. Space to reflect, to grieve, to try and heal. I still hadn't forgiven them, not truly, but there was no more pretending. And that, in its own way, felt like a small form of peace. Daniel and I spoke more now. There were no grand declarations between us, no dramatic apologies. Just quiet moments where he would sit beside me as I sorted through Eleanor's letters, or when we'd walk around the neighborhood without saying much at all. Grief had drawn a new line between us. Not a divide, but a shared path. One morning, he asked if he could read a few of the letters aloud. He said he wanted to hear her voice, even if it was through my voice. So we sat in the attic, our backs against the wall, as I read Eleanor's words into the dusty air. And for the first time, Daniel cried. I didn't say anything. I just let him feel it. He had buried so much for so long, just like I had. We were both victims of the same silence, just in different ways. Meanwhile, I started writing. It wasn't planned. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. But every evening, I found myself with a pen in my hand, pouring everything into a notebook. Not just the facts, not just what had happened, but how it felt. The confusion, the betrayal, the longing, the strange, quiet hope that still somehow managed to survive it all. Writing became a way to rebuild something inside me. I didn't know what the end goal was. A book? A personal journal? A letter to Eleanor that she would never read? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the act itself was the point. My mother watched me from a distance. She didn't try to interfere. Sometimes, I caught her standing in the hallway outside my room, her shadow long and still. Once, she left a photo album outside my door. Inside were pictures I had never seen before, of me as a baby, of Eleanor holding me in the hospital. There were notes written in the margins, in my mother's handwriting. Regrets, memories, small explanations. She didn't say anything about it, and neither did I, but I kept the album. Have you ever had to rebuild your sense of self from the ground up? It's a strange process, like sorting through wreckage after a storm. You don't always know what's worth saving, what needs to be let go, and what can be turned into something new. But you keep going. You gather pieces. You try to make sense of them. And slowly, without even realizing, you begin to feel whole again, in a different shape. One afternoon, I went to visit Margaret. She greeted me with that same steady calm, as though time didn't move as quickly in her little cottage. I brought her a copy of one of my writings, a short essay about Eleanor. I hadn't planned to share it, but something told me she needed to see it. She read it silently, then held it to her chest. She didn't cry, but her voice was thick when she thanked me. She said that telling Eleanor's story, even just to a few people, meant she hadn't been erased. That her love, her fight, her quiet strength, they would live on. I asked Margaret if she thought Eleanor would be proud of me. She smiled, said she didn't need to think. She knew. On the way home, I passed by the old park. The swings creaked in the breeze, just like they had when I was a kid. I sat on one and watched the sky change color as the sun dipped lower. I thought of Eleanor. I thought of the years we'd lost, the moments we never shared. But I also thought of the way I had found her, piece by piece, word by word, and how even in absence, she had shaped so much of who I was. And for the first time since this journey began, I smiled. Not because everything was healed, not because it all made sense, but because I was no longer alone in the truth. Autumn came early that year. The trees turned gold before September had even ended, and the air smelled of smoke and fallen leaves. I found comfort in the change of seasons, as if nature itself understood that I was moving from one life into another. The world was preparing to let go, and in a way, so was I. At school, I kept mostly to myself, not out of sadness, but because my inner world had grown so full. Every day brought new reflections, new realizations. I began to see people differently, how much they carried, how much they hid. It made me more patient, more gentle. Daniel was different too. He no longer avoided the subject of Eleanor. In fact, he started asking questions. Real questions. He wanted to know what she was like, what she had written about. We began reading her letters together, one by one. Some were short, some long. Some were lighthearted, others so full of longing that I had to stop midway through. One afternoon, we read a letter where Eleanor wrote about dreams she had for us. She spoke of birthdays missed, milestones imagined, the smell of our hair when we were small. She wrote about how she hoped we'd grow up kind. Not perfect, just kind. That word lingered in the room for a long time. Kindness. It felt like the one thing that could still save what remained. After that, Daniel began to tell me things he had never shared. about how he always felt like there was something unsaid in the house, about how our parents used to fight behind closed doors more than we realized, about the time he overheard our mother crying in the garage after getting a phone call. Now he believed it might have been Eleanor. We were rewriting everything we thought we knew, not to blame but to understand. One Sunday morning, I asked my mother if she would go with me to visit Eleanor's grave. She hesitated. Her hands clenched the dish towel she was holding. But after a long silence, she nodded. We drove in silence. The road was quiet, flanked by trees turning every shade of red and orange. When we arrived, I stepped aside and let her walk ahead. She stood before the gravestone for a long time, said nothing. Then she reached out and brushed away a few fallen leaves from the inscription. Her shoulders shook, just once. Then she turned to me and whispered that she was sorry. I didn't ask for what. I didn't need her to say it. Some things don't need words. They just need presence. That visit changed something in her. She became softer, more open. She started asking about Eleanor too. Quiet questions at first. Did she smile a lot? Did she like music? What kind of books did she read? I realized she was grieving, finally, not just for Eleanor, but for all the years lost to silence and fear. A week later, she handed me a journal. It was old, leather-bound, and filled with her handwriting. She said it was from the year before I was born, a record of her thoughts during the time Eleanor was still in our lives. Reading it was like stepping into a different version of her. A younger woman, torn by pressure and love, trying to do what she believed was right. There was fear, yes, but also admiration, even affection. She wrote about holding me for the first time and feeling like she was carrying someone else's child and her own at the same time. How that feeling both terrified and humbled her. It was hard to read, but it helped me see her not just as my mother, but as a woman who had made choices inside a storm. That's something we don't often do, isn't it? See our parents as people flawed, scared, trying. I still didn't have all the answers, but the more I uncovered, the more I realized that maybe answers weren't the point. Maybe love wasn't about understanding everything. Maybe it was about choosing to carry each other's truths, even the heavy ones. And in that choice, something like healing could begin. Eleanor had left behind letters, but now we were finally writing new ones, together. The closer I got to the end of Eleanor's story, the more I began to understand that it wasn't really an end at all. Grief doesn't have a clear finish line. Neither does healing. They wind through you, looping back when you least expect it, catching you off guard in the middle of a conversation or a walk, or a song you didn't know you remembered. That fall, I spent more time in the attic than I ever had before. Not searching anymore, not uncovering, just being. I kept the letters in a wooden box on a low shelf, neatly bundled and cataloged. Every now and then, I'd open one at random, letting Eleanor's voice reach me when I needed it most. Daniel started joining me in the attic more often. He brought snacks, music, sometimes just silence. It had become a space where we could both exist without performance. We were no longer the golden child and the forgotten one. We were simply two people trying to make sense of what had shaped us. We began recording ourselves reading the letters. It started as an idea I had, a way to preserve Eleanor's words beyond paper. I thought maybe someday I'd turn it into something more, something that could help others. Daniel agreed. And so, with an old microphone and a borrowed laptop, we began speaking her story into the quiet. The first time I read one of her more emotional letters aloud, my voice cracked, not because of the content. I had read it many times before, but because I realized something new in that moment. These weren't just Eleanor's memories. They were mine now too, passed on, claimed. One evening, I played one of the recordings for our parents. It was a risk, I knew, but I wanted them to hear her voice the way we did, not just as a reminder of their mistakes, but as a person, a mother, a woman who had loved deeply and been silenced. The room was quiet. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her hands clenched in her lap. My father sat still, his gaze unfocused. When the recording ended, no one spoke for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, my father asked to hear another. And so we played one more. That became a new tradition. Once a week, we'd sit down as a family and listen to one letter. No commentary, no discussion, just the sound of a voice that had waited years to be heard. Little by little, the walls between us thinned. Have you ever noticed how stories, even painful ones, can become bridges? The more we listened, the more the silence between us began to loosen. My mother started opening up about her own mother, a woman I had barely known but who had apparently been the root of many of her fears and decisions. My father admitted he hadn't known how to love properly, that he had grown up in a household where emotion was a weakness, not a strength. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained enough to begin rebuilding. One night, after we listened to a particularly hopeful letter, one where Eleanor imagined me as a teenager, walking by a river, chasing fireflies, my mother asked if she could keep a copy. I printed it for her the next day. She framed it and placed it on her nightstand. She said it helped her sleep. We were still a family full of fractures, but now those fractures were being traced with gold, like kintsugi. Still broken, but no longer ashamed of the cracks. At school, I was asked to write a personal essay for an upcoming event. I chose to write about Eleanor, not just her story, but what it taught me. About identity, about silence, about love that survives time, distance, and denial. I ended the essay with a line from one of her letters. You may not know where you came from, but you can still choose who you become. That line stayed with me. It became a mantra of sorts, echoing through the quiet parts of my mind. Because now, I was beginning to understand that Eleanor's story wasn't separate from mine. It was the root, and from that root I was learning how to grow. Winter arrived quietly. The first snow fell overnight, blanketing the rooftops and trees in soft white silence. I woke to a world hushed and still, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not closure. I don't think stories like mine ever truly close, but a stillness that let me breathe deeper. I walked outside and stood barefoot on the porch for a moment, feeling the cold sting my skin. The sky was pale blue, and everything shimmered under the weight of the frost. I thought of Eleanor, of all the winters she must have spent wondering where I was, what I was doing, if I was happy. I whispered thank you to the wind, unsure who I was addressing, her, the universe, myself. Over the holidays, our house felt different. We didn't pretend anymore. We didn't try to recreate old traditions that no longer made sense. Instead, we made new ones. Quiet dinners with fewer expectations. Conversations that wandered. Even laughter, genuine, surprising, healing. My mother gave me a scarf she had knitted in Eleanor's favorite color. She didn't say it outright, but I knew. My father bought an old cassette player and started digitizing home videos, some I'd never seen before. In one of them, I saw a woman's shadow in the background. I paused the video and rewound it again and again, certain it was Eleanor. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But I chose to believe it was. Margaret visited once during that time. She brought cookies and a small framed photo of Eleanor as a child. It sat on our mantel beside pictures of the rest of the family. No one questioned it. It belonged there. Daniel surprised me one day with a project of his own, a short documentary using the recordings we'd made. He added voiceovers, quiet music, and soft transitions. He said it was for school, but I knew it was more than that. He showed it to a small audience at a community event, and when it finished, there was silence in the room, the good kind. The kind that means people are holding something deep. Afterward, a woman approached me. She said the story reminded her of her own. A sister who vanished from their lives, secrets they had never talked about. She thanked me, said it made her feel less alone. That's when I realized Eleanor's story wasn't just ours. It was everyone's. Every family has something hidden, something unspoken. But when we name it, when we bring it into the light, something remarkable happens. We begin to heal not by erasing the past, but by honoring it. And so I kept writing, not because the story needed more chapters, but because I was still learning how to live with it. I wrote about Eleanor, about Margaret, about the attic and the letters and the long nights of doubt. I wrote about the moment I said her name out loud, and how everything shifted afterward. And I wrote about love. Not the kind found in fairy tales, but the kind that endures. The kind that survives misunderstanding, absence, grief. The kind that waits. I don't know what comes next. Life is messy, unpredictable. But I do know this: I carry Eleanor with me now. Not as a mystery, not as a memory, but as a part of me. Her strength, her softness, her voice. They are stitched into every step I take. Sometimes I return to the attic, just to sit. Not to read or search, just to remember, because some stories don't end. They echo. And in that echo, we find not only what was lost, but also what we've become. Thank you for walking this path with me. And if you've ever carried a silence of your own, maybe it's time to let it speak. This narration was created with the help of artificial intelligence. If you noticed any mistakes, feel free to share them in the comments so we can improve the experience for everyone.